is held hostage to Frederick in a way, just like she is held hostage by her family. Another parallel between Frederick and her family is Frederick's obsession with, or not. He's not as obsessed as Walter is with the Baronetage, but Frederick is cocky and reads and tells stories about the ships he's sailed. He fetishizes the what are called the publication of the Navy lists, the publication concerning the different ships in the Navy, and he reads his own story through the story of these ships, just like Walter reads his own story in the Baronetage. And so it's a similar kind of fetishized and reductive, reified, commodified existence that we see in Frederick as in Walter. But although Anne is, I think, dominated psychologically by these realities outside herself, we can see again through the narrative of her introspection, an assertion of a creativity, a power to maybe extricate herself from these patriarchal narratives outside her. And we see, I think we can hear in this passage a bit of a, just after her first encounter with Frederick, after his return, kind of echo of Wordsworth's Tintern Abby. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, that repetition of the number of years that have passed, and sort of this haunting memory, this sense of the past remaining present. This being haunted by the past. She had seen him, they had met, they had been once more in the same room. Like, she can't believe the memory has walked into the present and inhabits, reality in the present. So the narrator continues. Soon, however, she began to reason with herself and try to be feeling less. 8 years, almost 8 years had passed since all had been given up. How absurd to be resuming the agitation with such an interval had banished into distance and indistinctness. What might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes, alienations, removals, all must be comprised in it. An oblivion of the past. How natural, how certain too. It included nearly a third part of her own life. So, it concludes, and alas, with all her reasoning, she found that to retentive feelings 8 years may be little more than nothing. So the feelings are just as present as ever. So what might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes. All must be comprised in it, an oblivion of the past. How natural, how certain too. So here she's talking about, I think she's speculating about Frederick here as much as she's talking about herself. All of these possible changes, including oblivion, must be comprised in it. We must be assumed as natural, or even certain that he will have changed, alienated, removed, and become oblivious of the past. So this is free and direct discourse channeling Anne's thoughts, but they're contradictory thoughts. Um, on the one hand, she's saying oblivion is natural and even certain, but on the other hand, she's acknowledging that the past is just as present as ever, and 8 years are little more than nothing. So the free and direct discourse demonstrates Anne's conflicted thinking. She's at odds with herself, but that conflict is itself self-composing. I mean, after all, this is the conflict of Tintern Abby. The having the memory present alongside a self consciousness that's incompatible with it. So again, this active process of not changing the plot from one winner to another, but reweaving the details with maybe leaving the same events in place, but giving herself an active role as her self recollector, her active self composer. So Frederick's categorical denials to the contrary. He's evidently haunted by Anne too. I think this he brags of his simplicity. He dissembles in a way here that suggests this haunting. So he says he professes indifference to who he would marry, just as he professes not even to recognize Anne. He's sort of indifferent to who he would marry. He says, I'll take anyone, little beauty, a few smiles, a few compliments, and I'm a lost man. Shouldn't this be enough for a sailor like me who has had no society among women to make him nice? He said it, she knew, to be contradicted. He knows very well he's nice. His bright, proud eyes spoke the conviction that he was nice. And so this self-deception here, I think is really telling, and especially because this next line just feels really pregnant. Anne Elliot was not out of his thoughts when he more seriously described the woman he should wish to meet with. So I feel like that can either, I mean, you read that at first, he's saying he doesn't, Anne Elliot is the one woman that he's not considering. So you assume he's defining what he wants just in contrast to her. But he's haunted by her regardless, even if it is by contrast, even if he is just thinking of what he doesn't want. And it seems as though that might not just be the case. I mean, it might be more than that, just because this sentence, sort of, if you read it directly, it sounds like she's exactly what he wants. So we can see a kind of self-deception getting registered in his narrative. So in the contrast between Anne and Frederick, there's we see something kind of reminiscent of Blake's The Clod and the Pebble, I think. And we saw already how Anne is described as a kind of doormat, that people just walk over, whose convenience was to give way. And by contrast, Frederick's defined by his not just his constancy, but his kind of dogmatism about constancy. and that comes to light in this famous talk with Louisa he has, where on the allegory of the hazelnut, and this is overheard by Anne. Which is, I think, just sort of another version of the ideal of constancy, sort of the pebble as self-identical and unchanging. A beautiful glossy nut which, blessed with original strength, has outlived all the stores of autumn. Not a puncture, not a weak spot anywhere. This nut, he continued with playful solemnity, while so many of his brethren have fallen and been trodden underfoot, is still in possession of all the happiness that a hazelnut can be supposed capable of. My first wish for all whom I'm interested in is that they should be firm. And he says to her, sort of, referring to her in the third person and kind of objectifying her. That's in likening her to a nut. In other words, if Louisa Musgrove would be beautiful and happy in her November of life, she will cherish all her present powers of mind. So Louisa really takes this speech of Frederick's to heart, and tries to impress him, demonstrate to him her firmness of will, her constancy. But this ends up just totally backfiring when she, insofar as it leads her to jump off this wall in a reckless way. But what's crucial to notice is what she says as she jumps. "I am determined, I will." He put out his hands. She was too precipitate. By half a second, she fell on the pavement on the lower cob and was taken up lifeless. So just as in Blake's poem, this simplistic contrast between the impervious pebble and the squashed clod turns out to be more complex than it appears. And being, of a determined will can make you vulnerable. The tables are turned on Frederick in a similar way, I think, when he hears Louisa's response to his hazelnut speech. So, in other words, she responds in a way that shows his vulnerability. So she says, "Mary is good-natured enough in many respects," said she, "but she does sometimes provoke me excessively by her nonsense and pride, the Elliot pride. She has such a great deal too much of the Elliot pride. We do so wish that Charles had married Anne instead. I suppose he wanted to marry Anne?" So he did not know this, but what this story shows to him is kind of a reversal of what he had assumed in two ways, a double reversal. It shows both that Anne is not as proud as he had hoped. Louisa's saying, she's not as proud as Mary, and would have been preferable as a brother-in-law. But also that Anne is constant. It opens Frederick's eyes to the idea that Anne could have remained faithful to him, remained devoted to him. So just right in the moment after finishing this kind of again, cocky, simplistic speech about being firm as an absolute good. Um, his firmness is challenged by a more complex world than he appreciated before. So, Frederick, this hero of constancy and determination and will, um, in a way, ends up leading to this really reckless behavior by Louisa, which also ends up exposing Anne's level headedness and control in a way that complicates Frederick's a view of her. So this situation makes him aware of his own vulnerability and responsibility for others, and vulnerability. So responsibility for others, and also just vulnerability to accidents. I think that's a huge theme of the novel. As I said, just falling, accidents fall, things befall, shit happens, events befall. People fall in love. It's a metaphor for passion, to be sure, but it's also just a metaphor for life. You know, the child falls out of the tree. Just accidents happen. The horror of the moment to all who stood around. So it's sort of a bearing witness to the chaos, unpredictability of life in general, and that nobody can entirely control in the simplistic way of Frederick's hazelnut. That this happens on this jetty, out into the sea, is very symbolic of or connects to the symbolism of the sea as a place of this new mobility and chance interaction. Um, Looking on her with a face as pallid as her own. So he is injured. He is kind of unmanned in a way that's analogous to her. Scene at the Cobb is a very theatrical set piece. It's almost operatic, but I think it's actually so it can seem artificial, overly constructed, and dramatized kind of scene. But I think it actually contributes to the novel a really crucial element of realism, that is the proximity of death, the normative place of death in life, especially at the time. I mean, I think it has a prominence and importance in our lives that, still that we tend to overlook. Death brings out a kind of social dependence, family dependence that we otherwise might overlook. People were just so much more vulnerable back then. Life expectancy was so much shorter, and early illness and accidents were so much more common. I think that added another, just a dimension to social bonds that just further challenge Frederick's hazelnut theory. Austen shows that there's a physically dangerous side to Frederick's love. And I think there's an unmistakable subtext here of sexually transmitted disease. That, as attractive on the surface, like Blake's sick rose, Fred's hazelnut Self-image is lovely on the surface, but it conceals toxic social consequences for women's bodies in particular. So Fred is shown to be, importantly irresponsible, but he's also very needy. He reacts in a kind of hysterical way here. In this scene when they're driving Louisa home, trying to calm Henrietta, spare her from agitation, and yet it's Fred that is inconsolable, that can't bear mentioning of the incident. His language here, there's a kind of gender stereotype inversion. His language here, he sounds like the damsel in distress, or the woman grieving over having let her guard down sexually. So I think Frederick really importantly here represents a kind of toxicity of male toxicity, the way in which he's saying, on the one hand, I can't control myself, I'm not responsible for the consequences of my behavior, but like Victor Frankenstein, he's totally self-pitying. He on the one hand is a hazard to the public. On the other hand, he sees himself as a victim. So I think that same formula of kind of toxic masculinity is in play. Indeed, in words that reveal not just Frederick's, vulnerability, but the vulnerability precisely of his narcissism. His first words after her fall, he cries out for help for himself. Is there no one to help me? Were the first words which burst from Captain Wentworth in a tone of despair, as if all his own strength were gone. So that's really remarkable. It's not just that he's needy, but it's his egotism that's needy, his concern with himself. And Anne really takes charge in this scene. So Frederick kind of gains new insight into his own vulnerability, but also into Anne's strength. Frederick's new sense of vulnerability and responsibility for others comes out. His conversation with Anne, brief conversation as they're bringing Louisa home. He says to her, I've been considering what we had best do. She must not appear at first. She could not stand it. I've been thinking whether you had not better remain in the carriage with her while I go in and break it to Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove. Do you think this is a good plan? So this deferral to her judgment is it's a novel. It represents a kind of growth on Frederick's part, and it makes a big impression on Anne. She recognizes this deference to her. She did. He was satisfied and said no more. But the remembrance of the appeal remained a pleasure to her, as a proof of friendship and of deference for her judgment, a great pleasure, and when it became a sort of parting proof, its value did not lessen. This is an actual organic relationship. They're responding to, this actual, unpredictable circumstance. And it's revealing aspects of their character and their mutual recognition, how they see one another. Um, that is, richer, more complex than the simple, contrast, that dogmatic contrast that had defined it before. Um, Above all, in this moment, we can see Anne constructing her own memory, writing her story by how she arranges her memory. Um, this event does not make her and Frederick any less broken up. She doesn't have any, it doesn't give her aspirations about getting back together. On the contrary, she sees this as a parting proof of friendship. But it's a story that she's telling herself. She sees him seeing her, something real about her, and so she's overcoming this passive role that she had been playing of having her life, narrated for her. Now, at least, she's acknowledging and giving the power of proof, giving validity and legitimacy to her pleasure and self-respect. So what I think significant here is that Anne is developing a sense of herself. She's writing a story about herself, or reading herself in relationship to others, in a way that isn't just centered around the marriage plot. She's forsworn Frederick. She is no longer that no longer defines herself in terms of the marriage plot, or even romance with Frederick, and yet she is weaving a complex sense of herself. What matters to her is this mutual recognition that he sees things and values things in her, that she values in herself. And another example of that comes a little earlier when he helps her into the carriage. And again, this is kind of the stereotypical, like, Prince Charming move. But if you see the way she narrates it, or the way in which her thinking about it is channeled by the narrator. So this is a very, very powerful narrative here. Captain Wentworth, without saying a word, turned to her and quietly obliged her to be assisted into the carriage. Yes, he had done it. She was in the carriage and felt that he had placed her there. So this moment, this is another kind of like poetics of time. This the gap of the moment of being assisted into the carriage. It passes in a blur. It's not narrated. She returns to herself, returns to her kind of inner dialogue, only in retrospect. And see how she reflects on this moment. She felt that his will and his hands had done it, that she owed it to his perception of her fatigue and his resolution to give her rest. She was very much affected by the view of his disposition towards her, which all these things made apparent. This little circumstance seemed the completion of all that had gone before. She understood him. He could not forgive her, but he could not be unfeeling. though condemning her for the past and considering it with high and unjust resentment, though perfectly careless of her, and though becoming attached to another, still he could not see her suffer without the desire of giving her relief. It was a remainder of former sentiment. It was an impulse of pure though unacknowledged friendship. It was a proof of his own warm and amiable heart, which she could not contemplate without motions so compounded of pleasure and pain that she knew not which prevailed. Again, that formula of pleasure and pain, the sort of sublime. And again, this is like a proof, it's like a spectacle, a token of his friendship. She's reading it quite explicitly as she's reading human passion, reading human meaning through this behavior. And this reading is part of her self-determination. It's not determining herself as a wife. It's not assimilated to that narrative. She's given that narrative up. But it's a meaningful weaving together of a sense of herself through a sense of her relationship. She is seeing him, seeing her, just like Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice. Anne had earlier found solace in the conclusiveness of the story and perception she had of her relationship with Frederick. It was totally over. She could rejoice in knowing that with certainty that he had become a nothing to her. In a way, we can see her internalizing when she says these things, internalizing her own debasement, the way in which she's debased by her family and others around her. The reduction of her feelings to Frederick to a mere nothing. So in these later moments where we see her appreciating and reflecting on these kind of minor, marginal moments of interaction with Frederick, we see her opening up to her real feelings rather than remaining closed off and sort of in denial about this sense that Anne develops of herself independent of any determinate narrative of who she is, through her capacity for this kind of Wordsworthian self-recollection, comes out most famously, I think, in this in the moment of where again the tables are turned in a way. Frederick is overhearing her, where she had overheard him deliver the hazelnut speech. Now he's overhearing her in conversation with Captain Harville about the relative constancy and strength, fortitude of the love of men and women, and this theme of narratives, that who gets to tell the story, comes up when Harville said, I could bring you 50 quotations in a moment on my side of the argument, and I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say on woman's inconstancy. Songs and proverbs all talk of woman's fickleness, but perhaps you will say these were all written by men. And this is one of my favorite lines in the whole novel, the way she responds here. It sounds like the playful irony of Elizabeth, and it from Pride and Prejudice, and and this is the moment of Frederick falling back in love with her. While he's overhearing them, he's writing his love letter, his declaration of love to her. So that you can hear the irony in what she's saying, which is jokey, but I think it has a crucial underlying point about who gets to tell the story. And there's an independent sense of Anne's self-determination. She's telling her own story that she's developed by this point. But perhaps you'll say these were all written by men. And she replies, yes, perhaps I shall. Yes, if you please. No reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher degree. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. So again, back to that romantic point that life is in the moment. It's not to be captured or controlled, understood, fixed in language. So she refers again to the idea of proof. She says you can't rely on books. It's a difference of opinion between men and women that does not admit of proof. So it's interesting how she earlier used this word proof. I think she's using it in sort of different senses, like when the proof of friendship that she found in Frederick's deferral to her judgment, and his noticing of her fatigue and concern for her fatigue. Those were proofs of friendship, but they were only have personal value or validity to her. They're part of her own story, the way in which she's choosing to remember her relationship with Frederick and think about Frederick. They're not about proving definitively one argument or another is correct. The deepest irony in Anne's statement, of course, is that the pen is in Jane Austen's hands when she writes, the pen has been in men's hands. And I think the point, I think we are supposed to bear in mind that it's not just men's books that don't prove anything, but also Jane Austen's book, also the book in our hands. And that applies to the idea of, the title again, Persuasion. Language is something we do. We can't fix values, defined values definitively, or win arguments definitively. What books give us are allegories and metaphors that we can use to inform our construction of values, what counts for us moment to moment, but that question of proof and personal value is an ongoing process and judgment that is never definitive. Isn't reducible to the kind of fixity of a text. What she's saying here is precisely this: that each relationship is just full of accidents, and we can only the only proof we can get, or provable story, is the one we create for ourselves as we go along, navigating the uncertain circumstances of life. We each begin probably with a little bias towards our own sex, and upon that bias build every circumstance in favor of it which has occurred within our own circle, many of which circumstances, perhaps those very cases which strike us the most, may be precisely such as cannot be brought forward without betraying a confidence, or in some respect saying what should not be said. So in any event, the proof is what counts for oneself is too idiosyncratic to count objectively. So Captain Harville tells of such a story. The grief that a man feels as he says goodbye to his family. So, and Anne replies, I don't dispute that. I should deserve contempt if I dare to suppose that true attachment and constancy were only known by women. No, I believe you capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion, to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives and lives for you, all the privilege I can. So having an object, this men need the narrative of their own purposefulness and like actual the actuality of their love and accomplishment, their identity. Whereas by contrast, and continues, all the privilege I can claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone. So that's one of Anne's key lines in the whole book, and it's a paraphrase of Shelley's, one of the concluding lines of Prometheus Unbound, hoping till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. So Frederick, overhearing these words of Anne's, is pierced in his own words. Her words give him a new idea of constancy than he had conceived before. A richer one that's about kind of absurd faith. It's not about the actual narrative of actual life, but maintaining this hope, and so this romantic idea of the power of the imagination is what pierces him. So it breaks through his hazelnut hard armor. So in other words, Austen does not reduce the love affair or the story of restored love to a determinate narrative, a resolved narrative. She leaves it a open kind of bond on a more poetic plane, like just a shared dream. And I think that's that recalls how she narrates the restored love of Elizabeth and Darcy too. So listen to how she narrates the Darcy's Elizabeth's reaction to Darcy's second proposals. My affection and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of feelings which, improving of what important she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. Again, these terms, proof, value, but it's Austen does not spell it out. She leaves the narrative of Elizabeth's expression of love and the restoration of her love with Darcy in the same kind of blank generic terms that we saw before in the summary of Anne's initial romance with Frederick. It's just we just say he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and warmly as a man violently in love could be supposed to do. And then Austen even gives a kind of hypothetical. She tells us of how Elizabeth would react to Darcy's eye if she could see it, although she isn't. So that kind of dream, that hypothetical image or negative image, an image of what is not seen, so a romantic trope of fantasy imagination, and that's the place of proof of friendship, love, affection, the value of human compassion. In other words, the happy end of these love stories is like the happy end in The Eve of St. Agnes. It's left a dream. It's not determinately assured by the narrative. It's left instead, the narrative is assuring enough, but it's not spelled out. The happiness is not detailed in the narrative. It's left a place of imagination. So listen to how the moment of reconciled, restored love in Persuasion is narrated. Charles is walking with them and then says he's going to go back to town. There could not be an objection among Anne and Frederick. There could only be the most proper alacrity, a most obliging compliance for public view. Smiles rained in and spirits dancing in private rapture. So she's describing their joy as private. She's bracketing it off even from her own readers. It's bracket. They are disguising it from the public around them. But Austen, analogously, is veiling it to her readers, maintaining again that kind of blank mask, de-individuated. It's private rapture, letting the reader imagine what they will instead of spelling it out for them. Um, but she does spell out a kind of poetics of self authorship, imagining oneself into the future, imagining how one will remember this moment in the future. Um, Austin sort of designates the parameters of Anne's memory, how she will organize her emotions and memory, how she'll recollect herself. So in half a minute, Charles was at the bottom of Union Street again, and the other two proceeding together. And soon words enough had passed between them to decide their direction toward the comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, where the power of conversation would make the present hour a blessing indeed, and prepare it for all the immortality which the happiest recollection of their own future lives could bestow. There they exchanged again those feelings and those promises which had once before seemed to secure everything, but which had been followed by so many, many years of division and estrangement. There they returned again into the past, more exquisitely happy perhaps in their reunion than when it had been first projected, more tender, more tried, more fixed in a knowledge of each other's character, truth, and attachment, more equal to act, more justified in acting. And there, as they slowly paced the gradual ascent, heedless of any group around them, seeing neither sauntering politicians, bustling housekeepers, flirting girls, nor nursery maids and children, they could indulge in those retrospections and acknowledgments, and especially in those explanations of what had directly preceded the present moment, which are so poignant and so ceaseless in interest. All the little variations of the last week were gone through, and of yesterday and today there could scarcely be an end. It's like she's reborn, like a new time, a new kind of rhythm of time and experience is articulated. They've grown. They're more equal to act, more justified in acting. That's the narrator's free and direct discourse channeling, and so we're not told how they act exactly, but we're shown what it means to put dreams into action, what it means to be faithful to a dream. So acting on a dream is sketched out, much like in a Keats poem, the relationship between the fantasy and the living, breathing body is schematized, but not narrated, not reduced to a specific story. So I think we're left with the Cinderella story as a fantasy, like as a myth that we can inhabit and organize our lives. But Austen doesn't, offer readers the illusion of how it actually happened. She leaves that to the readers to, imagine for themselves and live out, justify, become equal to in their own actions. The 20th century poet W.H. Auden wrote a long poem in the style of Byron called Letter to Lord Byron. And he refers to Jane Austen in it. In this stanza, he also refers to James Joyce, whose books were outlawed, or Ulysses was outlawed as pornographic when it was first published. So he says, speaking to Byron, you could not shock her more than she shocks me. Besides her, Joyce seems innocent as grass. It makes me most uncomfortable to see an English spinster of the middle class describe the amorous effects of brass, reveal so frankly and with such sobriety the economic basis of society. I think Jane Austen does reveal a lot of uncomfortable truths about the market is, unfathomable. But I've tried to show that I think she gives the reader exercise in, something like what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to at least exercise autonomy over your desires and fantasies and memory. The way, the narrative of Elizabeth Bennet's successful response to Darcy's second proposal, hinges on the image of his face which she wasn't looking at. This kind of fantasy that's always a part of experience, a way in which our experience is always informed and framed by ideas, fantasies, imagination that go beyond what we can know. Allow us to, shape our time the way Anne does, and the analogous scene at the end of when Anne and Frederick are walking along the path, and the narrator says in Anne's voice something to the effect of how yesterday and today will never end. As she's taken control, a sort of imaginative authorship over her time, her embodied experience in time. I've compared Anne to the marginalized perspectives of women in the novel Frankenstein. Anne at the beginning of Persuasion. But I think one of the most beautiful passages in Persuasion is it's in Anne's voice, but it's about her friend Mrs. Smith, poor woman who Sir Walter is aggravated that Elizabeth takes time to visit. And Miss Smith, if anything, represents a marginalization far more radical than Anne's. But in this great passage, Anne reflects on that marginalization. In the course of a second visit, she talked with great openness, and Anne's astonishment increased. She could scarcely imagine a more cheerless situation in itself than Mrs. Smith's. She had been very fond of her husband. She had buried him. She had been used to influence. It was gone. She had no child to connect her with life and happiness again, no relations to assist in the arrangement of perplexed affairs, no health to make all the rest supportable. Her accommodations were limited to a noisy parlor and a dark bedroom behind, with no possibility of moving from one to the other without assistance. which there was only one servant in the house to afford, and she never quitted the house but to be conveyed into the warm bath. Yet, in spite of all this, Anne had reason to believe that she had moments only of languor and depression to hours of occupation and enjoyment. How could it be? She watched, observed, reflected, and finally determined that this was not a case of fortitude or of resignation only. A submissive spirit might be patient, a strong understanding would supply resolution, but here was something more. Here was that elasticity of mind, that disposition to be comforted, that power of turning readily from evil to good, and of finding enjoyment which carried her out of herself, which was from nature alone. It was the choicest gift of heaven, and Anne viewed her friend as one of those instances in which, by a merciful appointment, it seems designed to counterbalance almost every other want. So, in this class, I've tried to suggest that this ability to get carried out beyond oneself, to use imagination and the sense of negative capability, to put alternative scenarios in play, to have your sense of purpose always in question and a source of exploration and curiosity and imaginative creativity is crucial to crucial aspect of the kind of society, the kind of world that we live in. We're responsible for creating our own sense of purpose, and doing so is something that we do in time. It's about how we organize our time, and imagination is for application to our day to day, our actual time in the world. I talked a lot about value and proofs in this discussion of persuasion, and then it's interesting story. This 10-pound note with Jane Austen on the back has a quote from Pride and Prejudice. I declare, after all, there's no enjoyment like reading. What's funny about the quote, though, is that it's something that one of the Miss Bingleys say, who Austen really ridicules for not being a reader. She's just saying it to sort of try to impress Darcy or something, just trying to sound smart. So I think that's kind of, in a way, it's kind of perfect, that I think Austen it resists commodification. I think that's a kind of perfect irony. Even for no one shows as much insight into what Auden called the economic basis of society. But on the other hand, no one demonstrates such wit in maintaining a sense of play and imaginative distance and exploration in society, social conventions too. A basic idea that being able to read means being able to see the world otherwise, to not have your experience entirely determined by judgments or evaluations outside yourself. Austen recognizes the reality of economic power, but she, I think she's just as much devoted to the importance, that Miss Smith articulates of counterbalancing that with this grace of imaginative freedom. And that's the same thing that Keats is celebrating in on Chapman's Homer. It's not pretending to escape economy, the realms of gold, but just to keep open, a peace beyond peace. There's a dream of peace that we always have to measure and make the actual peace, the status quo, accountable to. There's, a dream of love that we always have to keep actual life and experience accountable to. Dreams of justice and so on. And we have to measure our own lives against how we might imagine our lives. And that's what Jane Austen novels are for. Giving us much smarter, better informed perspectives on domestic and intimate life. Much better informed about especially the experience of women, the embodied experience of women. Shame is a central theme in Jane Austen's novel, or fear, especially fear of shame, fear of losing class status, being snubbed. But Austen's novels also teach a kind of shame. That is they teach, a character like Frederick to be ashamed of a disregard of the consequences of his behavior that he had before. And that's a feature, I think, of romantic poetry in general. It's teaching us to be a better people, to be a better society, to be, better family members and lovers and so on. And it's a kind of, miraculous thing, but that we are, what Austen's novels do is test our capacity for empathy, for social imagination, thinking ourselves into the complexity of all sorts of social webs and networks. And that's an organic kind of learning. We become different people by imagining ourselves into these different kinds of networks. And the concern that we learn, is not easy to unlearn. And I think that's how a lot of social, progress happens, is by learning to notice people, perspectives, and things that we hadn't noticed previously. And once we do notice it, we can't, unnotice it. That's how women got the vote. It seems impossible on some level that, a minority that has the vote would give lessen the value of their privilege to expand the franchise to a broader voting public. But men were shamed into it. They, once they recognized the reality of other social perspectives, it gets very hard to unrecognize it. Again, that's why I think these social movements today around counting and noticing the experience of different kinds of racial and sexual minorities is so vital. I think an ongoing legacy of romanticism, and I hope this class has showed you how some of the literary techniques and the